Good morning, everybody. And first of all, sincere thanks to Christos and Susie and all those involved in organizing this fantastic event. As Joseph said, I'm sure I'm not alone to be very sorry to be unable to be there in person. So my thanks especially for facilitating this paper on technology through technology. That's my only Heidegger pun for the talk. I was not sure when I was invited to this event if I could contribute anything. Well, of course, I'm very aware of the dialogue between phenomenology and strands of Buddhist thinking, particularly as manifest, of course, in the Kyoto school around the idea of the nothing. I was not very well versed in mindfulness practice, and while I've been trying to learn more, I must preface my talk by noting that my knowledge in this area remains very much at the level of a novice. Nonetheless, what immediately sprang to mind was the familiarity of this term, mindfulness, and its rising ubiquity, particularly in our post-COVID world. I'm sure that my institution is not alone in offering staff and students various mindful interventions, such as wellness clinics, lunchtime mindfulness Zooms, mindful communities, wellness toolkits, and so on. Nor are these offerings restricted to educational institutions. They had become a feature of the corporate workplace long before the pandemic, especially in larger multinational organizations. The rising appeal of mindfulness coincides with its envelopment into the world of mental health management as primarily a means to the end of reducing stress and coping with anxiety. From about the early to mid 2000s, a proliferation of studies from questionnaires to MRI scans claimed to demonstrate the scientific proof of its benefits. And here I have no wish to engage in debate about what might constitute those benefits or how those benefits might be experienced. But I am interested in how mindfulness has been taken up by the corporate world as a way to offer its staff a means to cope with the stresses that the corporate world itself induces. So this is a screenshot from Headspace, one of these sort of mindfulness apps that I'm sure we're quite familiar with, and there are a number of these kind of things available. As a word in everyday discourse, mindfulness arrives to us tangled in a web of associated terms that capture a focus on the self and self-improvement that seems at least somewhat misaligned with its Buddhist origins. Practicing mindfulness is meant to make us better at dealing with the stresses of our capitalist and/or heavily technologized era. My claim in this paper is that mindfulness, in this everyday sense, has become part of what Martin Heidegger terms the technological enframing of the world, such that rather than freeing us from such a way of being, or such a way of being revealed, mindfulness in this ordinary contemporary sense, in fact, acts as a block to such freeing, precisely because its practice is used as a way to maintain us in this techno-corporate frame. Heidegger's question concerning technology from the earlier Bremen lectures of 49 begins by describing our ordinary understanding of technology as both instrumental, a means to an end, and anthropological, an activity, something that humans do. These two understandings work together. Humans posit ends and find the instrumental means of achieving them. While such a definition is not wrong, it is indeed correct, Heidegger tells us. This does not mean that it is true, understood as revealing the essence of technology itself. Technology is not to be thought along these instrumental lines, but rather to be understood as a mode of revealing. The matter, aspect, and telos come together through what Heidegger terms the fourth cause of the maker, who becomes co-responsible for the coming together of the others and bringing forth into appearance something new. So this is where he gives this example of the sacrificial chalice, and he talks about the silver, the matter, coming into relation with what he terms the aspect, the idea of chaliceness. And then he talks about telos in terms of setting boundaries around something such that it can come into itself, sort of circumscribing it. And then we have the maker who brings these three things together to bring into presence or bring forth into appearance this sacrificial chalice. These four ways then, matter, aspect, telos, maker, come together under the verb to occasion and what Heidegger terms poiesis. It is tempting and perhaps inevitable in this formulation to privilege the maker, the artist or artisan, or even technician. But what is key here is the coming together of these four things in a relation that somehow allows something new to presence. The maker takes the matter, aspect, and telos and brings them together in production, but only because these three are already in some way available to her and available to being in relation to her and to each other. The four ways of bringing forth something gather within the broader context of a certain epochal horizon, and that horizon itself is but one side of what Heidegger terms the region, de Gegenwart or de Gegend aller Gegenden. And I'll come back to that idea of the region a little later. Poiesis then is bringing something forth into presencing or into appearance. As such, it is not even restricted to being produced. Indeed, Heidegger claims that physis is also a kind of poiesis, insofar as it brings something new into presence. So he says, physis is indeed poiesis in the highest sense. For what presence is by means of physis has the eruption belonging to bringing forth, for example, the bursting of a blossom into bloom in itself. I think it was in Francesca's paper yesterday, we had that nice line from Silesius on the rose. There is already in the plant this possibility to bring forth in itself. In contrast then, Heidegger says, what is brought forth by the artisan or the artist, for example, the silver chalice, has the eruption belonging to bringing forth, not in itself, but in another, in the craftsman or the artist. Technology as a mode of revealing is a relation then between being and humans through which something can be brought forth or produced. There is nothing in and of itself that is dangerous in technology as a way of revealing the producibility of things, as long as we can maintain a mastery of this one mode of revealing without allowing it to become the only way of revealing. And I think it's difficult to ascertain in Heidegger what would constitute that kind of mastery such that we could, leave technology alone or leave this particular way of revealing alone. But he does seem to think there is some way that we can do that. Modern technology, however, has shifted in some way. There is a relationship between modern technology and physics through which they further each other. But that is not the whole story. The mutual relationship between physics and science more generally and technology has transformed its essence from bringing something forth into presence, a kind of poiesis, to rather a challenging of nature. Our current era, the atomic era, the technological era, one might add the late capitalist era, is characterized, however, as being one which is under what Heidegger in the earlier mindfulness text terms the coercive force of machination. So he says, machination means the accordance of everything with producibility, indeed in such a way that the unceasing, unconditioned reckoning of everything is pre-directed. And not only here is everything revealed in terms of its producibility, what can I make with this, but also in terms of its ongoing and indeed endless further producibility, efficiency without end in both senses of that term. It's not just that I can now sow the seeds of wheat to create more wheat. It's that I do that with this sort of strange end of making more wheat to make more seeds, to make more wheat, and so on it goes. Techno-corporate is reduced to manufacturing. So he says, the revealing that rules in modern technology is a challenging, which puts to nature the unreasonable demand that it supply energy which can be extracted and stored as such. This setting upon the challenges the energies of nature is an expediting, and in two ways. It expedites in that it unlocks and it exposes, yet that expediting is always itself directed from the beginning toward furthering something else, that is, toward driving on to the maximum yield at the minimum expense. And as an example of how this transforms our engagement with our world, and indeed our world's engagement with us, Heidegger goes on to give this by now very famous example of the Rhine. So this is quite a long quote. So he says, the hydroelectric plant is not built into the Rhine River, as was the old wooden bridge that joined bank with bank for hundreds of years. Rather, the river is dammed up into the power plant. What the river is now, namely a water power supplier, derives from the essence of the power station. In order that we might even remotely consider the monstrousness that reigns here, and I think this word is really significant, this idea of something being shown, but also as monstrare, but also being monstrous, right? What is shown here is not what is as such, but this kind of deformed sense of what is, where it is not shown in itself. So in order that we might even remotely consider the monstrousness that reigns here, let us ponder for a moment the contrast that is spoken in the two titles, the Rhine as dammed up into the power works, and the Rhine as uttered by the artwork in Halterlin's hymn by that name. But it will be replied, the Rhine is still a river in the landscape, is it not? Perhaps. But how? In no other way than as an object on call for inspection by a tour group ordered there by the vacation industry. There is a parallel to be drawn, I believe, here in what the corporatized version of mindfulness has become. As the Rhine is revealed, not as it is, but in terms of the power station, a mere object on call, ready for inspection by a guided tour, so too has mindfulness become a tool understood in terms of the power station or the call center or the exam hall. Mindfulness, we might object, is still a practice like the meditative practice of the Buddhist tradition, perhaps, but in these settings at least, only as part of the toolkit of the wellness industry. Heidegger names the manner in which what is revealed as standing reserve or ready for production, the Gestell or enframing. Crucial to this term is our envelopment within it. It is not the case that we ourselves are in some manner at the edge of the frame, looking at some kind of picture in which nature appears as a resource for manufacturing. Rather, the Gestell is what gathers us ourselves, sends us on the way, or destines us to ordering of the standing reserve. The Gestell is not just how we uncover the world, but it is also something we are sent off on. We ourselves are part of this enframing. we are in some sense, we're always destined, sent down a certain path of revealing, of finding or uncovering what is actual in a certain way. Poesis too is a destining in this sense. All destining is dangerous in that it makes a certain way of revealing available, and in so doing closes off other ways of revealing. However, destining as in framing, or as the Gestalt, is what Heidegger terms the supreme danger. As part of the Gestalt, what is actual or unconcealed becomes only standing reserve, and we become only its orderer. We come, Heidegger warns, to the brink of a precipitous fall, where we ourselves may be taken as standing reserve. The second danger of the Gestalt as this certain destining or a certain way of revealing is that to quieten the fear of such a fall, we delude ourselves into thinking that we are lords of the earth and that all we find is of our making and for our making. But perhaps the greatest danger of this enframing lies in the manner in which it forecloses ourselves from ourselves. So Heidegger writes, man stands so decisively in subservience to the challenging forth of enframing that he does not grasp enframing as a claim. He fails to see himself as the one spoken to, and hence also fails in every way to hear in what respect he exists in terms of his essence in a realm where he is addressed, so that he can never encounter only himself. The rule of enframing threatens man with the possibility that it could be denied to him to enter into a more original revealing and hence to experience the call of a more primordial truth. So the danger of framing is that we don't even notice it. We don't even see this manner in which we have been sent down this certain way of revealing. We don't even see what is unconcealed as unconcealed, let alone as in some kind of tension or relation with what remains concealed or held back. And so for this reason, Heidegger thinks it is the supreme danger. As to what might save us from such a danger, what might return us to dwelling within our own essence, Heidegger offers the term Gelassenheit, releasement or letting be. And I will turn to that in just a moment. But first, I would like to draw a parallel between the dangers Heidegger describes of the enframing and those described by Marx in the account of alienated labor. There is sadly not the time here to give the relation between these thinkers, the space it would require. And so what follows is merely a suggestion of one possible route of thinking these thinkers together. As we know, Marx's philosophical manuscripts describe the modern industrial subject's alienation according to four related modalities. The worker is alienated from the product, from the activity of work, from their species being, and from others. These four moments, I think, are best understood as four aspects of the same alienation. For Marx, the capitalist subject is cut off from their species being by being reduced to a mere survival. Our essential nature is to manipulate our material world beyond merely that which is required to survive, but towards that which allows us to flourish. Under the distorted frame of capitalism, this free activity is harnessed and put to the use of capitalism itself. What is most human, to make something, or in Heidegger's terms, to bring something forth into presence, a kind of poesis, is mobilized against the worker so that their activity is not free nor transcendent. What is animal becomes human, and what is human becomes animal, argues Marx. The worker is not free at work, where they must produce a product not of their choosing, And in this lack of freedom, they lose their humanity. At home, where freedom might be found, there is only the time or energy to accomplish mere animal survival, eating, drinking, procreating. The relationship with nature has become interrupted and blocked, such that access not only to sustenance, but also to the material required to engage in the free activity of making is prevented. So Marx says, labor does not only produce commodities, it produces itself and the worker as a commodity. And it does so to the same extent as it produces commodities in general. The worker puts his life into the object. It exists outside him, independently as something alien, as confronting him as an autonomous power. And he goes on, it replaces labor by machines, but it throws one section of the workers back to barbaric labor, and it turns the remainder into machines. It would be unwise to map too neatly this account of alienation onto Heidegger's description of the Gestalt. Nonetheless, some points suggest themselves almost too loudly to be ignored, that our contemporary social structure disfigures a way of being that is more attuned to our essential nature is perhaps the most obvious. While Heidegger at times warns that humans are never transformed, he says, into mere standing reserve, he later claims that they can in fact come to such a point. So he says, the man at the switchboard and the engineer in the drafting room, each of these in its own way, belongs as stock part, available resource, or executor within the unframing. Like the capitalist worker, the structure of which we are part and through which we reveal the world, or it is revealed to us, can reduce us to mere parts of the structure or machine. Equally, Marx and Heidegger share a concern for the manner in which nature and our relation to it has been degraded, such that nature is viewed as resource and resource only, to stand against us, confronting us or challenging us, uprooting us and indeed itself. Finally, and far beyond my remaining time today, there are obvious points of friction and compatibility around the theme of history. While both thinkers broadly claim our salvation from these distorting frameworks lies in becoming aware of them, how such awareness to come about or what such a salvation would look like reveals some far more radical thinkers between them. I offer this rough sketch of the relationship between Heidegger and Marx in order to further drive home my claim that mindfulness in its ordinary everyday understanding today has become part of the techno-capitalist era in which we find ourselves. Ironically, perhaps, Heidegger's salve from this lostness from ourselves comes in the form of something close to mindfulness in its Buddhist origins, Gelassenheit, releasement towards things or letting be. I mentioned earlier the manner in which we are destined or sent on a way of revealing, and framing being one such way or destining. This destining, however, should not be misconstrued as fate or as some kind of anathema to freedom. On the contrary, Heidegger describes freedom precisely as that which governs the revealed. In other words, freedom arises or is gifted to us, not in overcoming destining as such, but rather in recognizing that we are destined. In awareness of this, we become open to what Heidegger terms the mystery, the play of concealment and unconcealment that constitutes the truth of being. We become free from the error of thinking being and our own being in terms of merely what is unconcealed. This does not mean that we arrive at some truth that stands before us, which we can put to use, but rather that we can be in truth in a more primordial way. Becoming aware of this destining involves this releasement or letting be, of thinking in a way that does not try to grasp onto some object within a horizon, or indeed to transcend such an object, but rather to remain open to that which is beyond the horizon itself, the region. Heidegger says, releasement, Gelassenheit, is indeed the release of oneself from transcendental representation, and so a relinquishing of the willing of a horizon. Such relinquishing no longer stems from a willing, except that the occasion for releasing oneself to belonging to that which regions requires a trace of willing. This trace, however, vanishes while releasing oneself and is completely extinguished in releasement. And we might come back in the discussion to what a trace of willing might be. Mindfulness in contemporary discourse has become co-opted by the corporate world and put to work in the service of production and of maintaining us as productive. It has become a means of blocking our way to genuine meditative thinking, releasement, and openness to the mystery. The corporate version of mindfulness is not about thinking that which is concealed in what is unconcealed or the mystery of being, but is there to quieten the call to which we should be listening that manifests in our anxiety. As such, the question we might be left with, and what I would like to end with today, is how to name this subterfuge such that we recognize it. Perhaps we should abandon this term mindfulness to its technological incorporation altogether. Perhaps, like the laden language of philosophy as metaphysics, for mindfulness to retain its possible freeing power, we need a new language or a new name. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lisa, for that talk. We'll go straight now to Timothy Mooney. Tim, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can perfectly. Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly. So I'll just introduce you quickly. This is Dr. Timothy Mooney, who's an associate professor in UCD. I'm sure probably well known to most of you, has published a huge amount across a range of thinkers in philosophy and phenomenology. Literally way too many publications to start listing, so I won't go to the trouble. I'll just hand over to you, Tim, and welcome you to the event.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And thanks to Christos and Susie and Evie and all organizers. And my apologies to those whose papers I have missed and will miss of unfortunate necessity. And this is also unfortunately why I'm not in Cyprus. This is not so much mindfulness in Merleau-Ponty as Merleau-Ponty and mindfulness. And I guess that mindfulness, in fact, I know that mindfulness in Merleau-Ponty has been very well covered by Petrie and Hayden and others, but to this paper. In Merleau-Ponty's later work, we find certain themes and conceptions that show an overlap with mindfulness. These include the reversibility of flesh, the richness of things in the perceived world that draws towards them, and the emphasis on painting as that medium that brings this world of perception to light, the ways in which we perceive it and better ways of perceiving it. In this paper, I argue that many of these themes are also found in his earlier work. In Phenomenology of Perception especially, he characterizes the essentially embodied subject as once an essentially projective existence. It does not live in a world of proximate opportunities and threats, but is situated in the further and virtual future, or rather futures. This is due to the productive imagination and the skilled and schematized body with its motor intentional schematizations of postures and fields. Yet Merleau-Ponty does not see projection in exclusively imaginative and volitional terms, that is, as the choosing of authentic and self-transformative courses of action. Many of our projects are solicited by the things themselves as determinable indeterminacies that draw us closer, not to command them, but to appreciate their singularities or perceptual styles. In his descriptions of living amongst and towards the things, he proffers a kind of mindfulness that evokes our quasi-mindfulness, that evokes much of the magic in childhood and that enjoins a more centered existence in adulthood. Mindfulness is a theory and a practice in which the value of the theory can best be seen in the practice. On my understanding, limited as it is the technique and distance, the successful endeavor to do so. To be mindful is to live fully in the present, to maintain an ongoing attentiveness to our perceptions, thoughts, emotional and body feelings, and wider milieu. This attentiveness is in the same blow and acceptance of our perceptual and conscious and affective states, without evaluating them from on high. Originating in Buddhist beliefs and meditative practices, contemporary mindfulness has a more secular character, indebted very much to the work of Jon Kabat-Zinn. It's to be stressed that mindfulness is not an arcane or mystical practice, or something imposed on our ordinary existence from outside. Rather, it is a cultivation of capacities that we already possess, and which, when cultivated, would help ourselves and others. It's accessible to all, reduces stress and the negative emotions, allows us to better negotiate the troubles and even the triumphs of everyday existence. Elation can be as unwarranted as depression or melancholia, and it is just as important to stress that we necessarily practice mindfulness as embodied beings. It is a practice for humans as integrally psychophysical unities in the world. The person familiar with phenomenology will immediately spot some similarities with the Husserlian methodology of bracketing and reduction. What's called the reduction is a return inquiry or questioning back. The task is not to take the natural attitude within which we perceive worldly things as true or false. Rather, it is to reveal its innocent and original sense, a sense that philosophy can uncover but never alter. More than the natural belief must be put in parenthesis, since it is only held by awareness, by virtue of appearances for that awareness. For this reason, the entire phenomenon of the being who lives believingly in the natural attitude has to be bracketed. Its flow of awareness with its perceptual objects and perceptual fields and memories and imaginings must be put in parenthesis, and with them its lived body and everything that is perceived in it and on it and from it. Everything must be bracketed so that nothing is lost for reflective focus. Whatever I perceive thematically is always and already implicated in a situation, such as the steep hill I'm seeing in front of me and above me and feeling under my feet, and which I'm ascending to get exercise and to enjoy the view. What is bracketed is the whole experience, the phenomenon of the seen hill and anticipated panorama within the world for this conscious existent, and the phenomena of my body as engaged in climbing, and of the effort I'm making. The conscious embodied existent for whom objects and world come to appearance must be a factor in their description. It might be thought that this is to introduce theoretical reflection into our perceptual episodes, but Merleau-Ponty would respond that specifically phenomenological reflection thematizes our innocent and attentive relations to the things of perception. It is imperative to take things as they present themselves and as they have their own proper significations for us. In this specifically phenomenological version, reflection does not withdraw from the world. Rather, it steps back to see transcendency spring forth, and it loosens the intentional threads that connect us to the world in order to make them appear. And if I am to be faithful to this procedure, I must not first define the senses, but rather regain contact with the sensoriality that I live from within. Attentiveness to my comportment in perceiving, and for that matter to the comportment of children, shows me that we do not begin with discrete sensory capacities. Rather than being made up of externally juxtaposed organs, the living and perceiving body is a synergetic system in which the different modalities are taken up together. The unity between our different organs of sense and between these and our powers of movements is original. It is not produced gradually and through accumulation. Their work shortly after birth is, of course, rudimentary and cannot yet facilitate the performative and recursive syntheses needed for cognitive activities. Nonetheless, one's limbs are not objects or focal powers of action. Ordinarily, my leg is with me as an ambulatory power, not as something located 80 centimeters beneath my head. My hand is with me as a power of grasping and lifting and manipulating, and for that matter, caressing. My not having to objectify my body is due to the work of the body schema as the holistic and projective organization of posture. Each of its projections towards a certain end, Merleau-Ponty calls a motor intentionality. Working with vision, the vestibular system, and other sources, each sub-representational plan of action for the body is in one and the same blow or route to realization, since it predelineates the path to be taken through the perceptual field. It articulates space and the things within it into practical vectors and lines of force, And in so doing, it constitutes an anisotropic, spatiality of situation, as opposed to an idealized spatiality of indifferent position. On Merleau-Ponty's account, what I am doing, why I am doing it, and the way of doing it, if insofar as it is conscious, pertains to conscious intentionality or act intentionality. The subconscious way of proceeding and how I'm proceeding that way pertain to motor intentionality, which does not attend act intentionality without. The two are moments of one overall intending. Within it, the former is invisible, an operative moment free of the act-object cognitions involved in learning the skills whose deployments it prefigures. In the progression from infancy through to maturity, the acquisition of bodily skill that is deployed without representation and bodily objectification entails the reworking of our postural organization. Once the skill is fully acquired, our previous moments are integrated into a new motor entity, and the first visual givens are integrated into a new sensorial entity. In concert with language and instruction, it is just this schematized and schematizing body that frees up the productive imagination for the framing of new and novel possibilities. For Merleau-Ponty, to be human is to be making some possibilities real and to be considering other ones. Some possibilities are weighted positively and valorized, in that I desire them and think I should pursue them. I may even picture a life needing decades to attain, yet reckon with it in the light of my existing skills or those that I envisage acquiring in the future. I quote, "The life of consciousness, epistemic life, the life of desire or perceptual life, is underpinned by an intentional arc that projects around us our past, our future, our human milieu, our physical situation, our ideological situation, and our moral situation, or rather, that ensures that we are situated within all these relationships. The intentional arc creates the unity of the senses with intelligence, and the unity of sensitivity and motility," unquote. It is not difficult to see early Heideggerian resonances in the foregoing, and this is confirmed elsewhere in phenomenology perception. The normal person reckons with the possible, and beneath all the meaning of the word sense, we find the same fundamental notion of a being who is oriented or polarized towards what he is not. My existence itself is an act or a doing, since an act by definition is the violent passage from what I have to what I aim at, or from what I am to what I have the intention of being. And it is by resolutely taking up what I am by chance, by willing what I will, by doing what I do, that I can go further. And Merleau-Ponty seems to take the world as a fund of resources for a self-transcendent subject. Even prior to conscious projection, my first perception inaugurated an insatiable being who appropriates everything that it can encounter, to whom nothing can be purely and simply given because it inherited the world. He adds that instinct carries in itself the plan of every possible being. We strive for an optimal hold on what we engage with, and when our natural means fall short, we construct instruments, projecting a cultural world that drives back the natural world. This raises the worry that each of us is regarded at root as an unceasing project of acquisitive appropriation. Others and things would seem to be the means for realizing our projects before being anything else. And the natural world for our projects would seem to closely remember that of the Heidegger of being and time. In this natural world, the wood is first and foremost a forest of timber, the mountain a quarry of rock, and the river a power of water to be harnessed, which of course brings us back to Lisa's paper. Merleau-Ponty is another thinker who exemplifies what the later Heidegger calls the age of the world picture. The world is enframed and frozen into a structured image that is amenable to scientific calculation and exploitation. And it is exploited because of the subject's will to enhance its being, increases willed at every level of human existence, affecting an unending spiral of consumption. If everything is implicitly taken as a reservoir of raw material, according to Heidegger, humanity too will come to be absorbed into this standing reserve. Having developed its own momentum in technology, the will to will is turning against its possessor. The subject is being enslaved by its own fabrications, being leveled down like the world itself. All this looks like a world away from mindfulness, so to speak, but some of Merleau-Ponty's remarks can be qualified. On my reading, the hyperbolic remarks about an insatiable being appropriating everything it can encounter hark back to a child whose enthusiasm and curiosity were boundless, and who as an adult still encounters the things of the world as wondrous and inspiring. On this interpretation, our dealings with others and things are not being thought in fundamentally instrumental terms and would include acts of bringing both lives and things to further expression through speaking speech, Merleau-Ponty's phrase for the creative use of language or some other art. This reading is consistent with his attentiveness to the transcendence of others and their singular styles, and with his contention that the most authentic existence is lived in solidarity with them. Every authentic project is mine as my decision and lived by me, though whether my responsiveness is sourced in oppressed people around me or in the loved one before me, I cannot consistently will freedom without willing it for all. And when we consider our world, it is stressed that it is in an open and indefinite multiplicity where relations are reciprocally implicated, as distinct from the scientistic picture of a scientific universe, namely of a complete totality in which all relations are reciprocally determined. When he turns to the things of the world, moreover, Merleau-Ponty gives us an account of attentiveness to the things that are solicited by the things themselves, and is not to be understood in causal or calculative terms, nor is attentiveness to be understood in an intellectualist register. If infants are originally driven or carried forward by their instincts, constituting elementary interest formations to facilitate the satisfaction of biological needs, they soon begin to show a distinctively perceptual interest beyond mere striving. Only by way of this interest can a proto-objective configuration exercise an allure leading to its objectification, such that the attentionally targeted thing is the motive and not the bare cause or bare reason of the perceptual event. As we grow up, the perceptual interest founds and becomes interwoven with the cognitive interest, initially practical and then more abstractly theoretical. Yet the syntheses preceding thematic perception always prefigure something as attractive or repulsive before it is cognized as black, blue, or circular or square. What also persists from infancy is the endeavor to perceive an attractive object as clearly as possible. Our postural attitudes display our orientation towards the best articulations of things, well before we pursue the optimal appearances that are stipulated by our crafts or professions. Early and interested viewings in infancy carry into more extensive actions, favored as the best ways of reaching richer perceptual givenness or fulfillment. The sensible articulations of things are revealed by interested existence, not by spectators with no concerns before or after theoretical cognition. Each perception is a communion, and we can only posit the thing at the end of a gaze or at the conclusion of a sensory exploration that invests it with humanity. Such communion is solicited or invited by the things themselves, and when we recognize that these draw us in closer, it needs to be added that the horizon of perceptual attention is not the mere anticipation of the hidden sides or back of a thing. It is also an anticipation of features within the aspect directly present to the perceiver that are too distant to be clearly articulated from the current standpoint. We are co-intending in this way when we walk up to a sign in order to read it. So is the baby who crawls towards a shiny something and who lifts it up to see it better after clutching it. These ongoing explorations are important in showing us that the thing already has a dynamic sense for the infant, for it has motivated both the interest in and the expectation of new and novel fulfillments. There is therefore an awareness in early life that what is currently perceived has not been exhausted perceptually. Exploratory attention is for the most part experienced as a progressive and satisfying passage from a broad and loose determination of an object to one that is more refined and more distinct. There is neither chaos at the beginning, since infants are motivated by alluring configurations, nor complete determination at the end, since only some features are now more determined within an unsurpassable indeterminacy. It is the very broadness and looseness of features, their element of indistinctness, that motivates continuing explorations leading to novel articulations. Both causal and intellectual accounts see indeterminacy in negative terms as something to be eliminated, whereas for Merleau-Ponty, we must recognize the indeterminate as a positive phenomenon. The indeterminacy of a thing is not readily evident in developed perception, and neither is its singularity. Knowing how to get our bearings and deal with things in our hurried working lives We quickly use the door here and the table and window over there. But when I have the time and the inclination to attend closely to a thing, it ceases to be an allusion to a general type, and I realize that it has a distinctive perceptual style. In zoning in on a once-off arrangement of foliage or of growth rings, I may see this feature of the tree or bench for the first time, even though I saw the whole object before. These uncommon episodes tell us that adult perception usually passes over the empirical depth and richness of the perceived thing, and that the concepts we employ always do. Yet the contours of natural objects are of no concern for the scientistic intellectualist. Their styles are inexact and therefore irrelevant, lying beneath the purview of physical theoretical concepts. Descartes thinks this way in affirming the sameness of the piece of wax. As material extended, it can assume an infinity of shapes and positions, but these determinations which are objective are indifferent, holding for each and everybody. What is perceptually distinctive about wax is dismissed. For everyday perception, it will rapidly become soft when heated and assume a shade that suggests its softness and the muffled sound it would make if struck. These potentialities contribute to the sense of this peculiar something, even if the original smell, sweetness, and shape have vanished without return. But Descartes never admits them as warrants for its permanence. These secondary qualities have no bearing on the identities determined by natural science. One may well espouse an intellectualism without a scientism, but still pass over the fineness of grain of the thing. In a developed awareness, according to John McDowell, our use and public expression of demonstratives such as this or that show that conceptual capacities extend to the very edge of sensibility. Everything is perceived as a determinable particular, and in this light we can call a variant of a color that shade of a thing, and develop a concept that is as fine-grained as the actual perception of that shade, proceeding from determinability to actual determination. In the absence of color for McDowell, the concept remains adequate if it survives in thoughts based on memory. But if demonstratives can reach the edge of objectifiable sensibility, they do not convey the horizontal predelineation in which the sense of the present figure is bound up with potential appearances. When finer grained concepts are brought into play, moreover, they do not close off the possibility that what will be brought to presence will surprise us without models drawn from previous experience. Things are conceptually determinable without ever being fully determined or conceptually saturated. Even our empirical concepts for the features of figures are at best indicative of our perceptual discriminations. This is discovered in going beyond sedate episodes of apprehending homogeneously colored expanses. Imagine seeing a piece of lacework for the first time without having encountered a Tenerife pattern or point coupe. The initial conceptualization by way of a demonstrative will be coarse-grained. And when finer concepts come to be acquired on the basis of a newfound interest, it is highly unlikely that they will keep up with the large and ever-increasing variety of lace patterns that one will encounter in the future. Such concepts will stabilize visual memories and therefore help to perpetuate them, but can hardly prevent the ultimate decay of their details. With complex patterns, it is hard to provide a substitute for direct acquaintance or even for the pictures found in brochures. Were it somehow possible for an expert in lacework to have fine-grained empirical concepts based on memories of all the patterns perceived to date, the latter could only be reconstructed accurately by being painstakingly drawn out on paper, since each remembered glance only registered one sector of a complex pattern before shifting. The reactivation of such memories needs sensible illustration, unlike that shade or homogeneously colored expanse. And even then, the expert's everyday repertoire of concepts and images would lag far behind the complexities exhibited by other things of use and indeed of delight. It should not be forgotten that in discussing our perceptual interests, Merleau-Ponty is typically concerned with natural things rather than with artifacts. Consciously wrought products cannot help but bear references to their creators. When we attend to them, they appear as if placed on the natural world, rather than as inexhaustible things that are immanent within it. Yet it is natural things that fascinate us in their depth and empirical richness, a view that we also find in Merleau-Ponty's later work, not least in painting. He remarks that Impressionism first sought to capture the way that objects originally appear to us, without fixed and precise contours, and at the same time without tones that are broken up altogether. things were depicted in their outdoor presence in the light and air, that is, in a certain vibrant mood or atmosphere. Cézanne would both preserve and surpass this aesthetic. Like the Impressionists, he does away with exact contours, giving color priority over the outline. If one were to trace out the shape of an apple in a continuous line, one would abandon the visible world for geometry. Not to indicate any shape would deprive objects of their identity. Cézanne seeks to avoid a fissure between the stable things that we see and the shifting ways they appear. The aim is to depict the birth of order through the spontaneous organization of parts. To paint the impression of an order coming into presence, Cézanne departs from Impressionism, using graduated colors with unique progressions of chromatic nuances across each object. The object is not submerged in its wider relationships and deprived of solidity and materiality. Instead, it is subtly illuminated from within. One's glance rebounds amongst the modulated colors and finds the shape that emerges from them all, just as it does in lived perception. And in seeing the shape of things, one should also see their hardness and softness and smoothness, and even their odor. For all that such a seeing can only hint at the unsurpassable plenitude that divides the real. Hard outlines do not just sacrifice the process of emergence, but also depth, that dimension in which the thing appears, not as spread out before us, but as an inexhaustible fund of possibilities. Cézanne would sometimes ponder for hours before putting down a stroke, and would have to contain the air, the light, the object, the character, and the style. Each brushstroke must speak to an infinite number of conditions, the expression of existence being an endless task. Now, all this is well and good, and yet Merleau-Ponty pays little attention to the things that we fashion for use. On his account, it is only when artifacts present themselves as obstacles that we pay heed to them. To this roadway, our metro door is stubbornly impassable. Spot Heidegger again. Yet the case can and should be made that the difference between the world of natural things that draws us towards them and the world of artifacts is not absolutely unbridgeable. We can be mindful in admiring and exploring things, but also in using them. This point was broached by the later Heidegger and has been expounded admirably by Matthew Crawford. Building on his experiences as a political philosopher and as an independent mechanic, Crawford decries the devaluation of manual skills and trades in today's so-called knowledge economy. Running with this is the designed inaccessibility of everyday appliances. To use things with care and select those that one can maintain and repair through the years is a good route to a happier and more fulfilled life. Such a way of being is geared into concrete reality and less into digital representations. And even when one is not explicitly mindful of what one is doing, it is surely the case that a mindful relation to the implements that we take up can become habitual. What is done more slowly and carefully is usually done better. So far, I've concentrated on mindful relation to things, and I've said little about the body beyond motor intentional schematizations. These are subconscious, not being perceived reportably or representative imaginatively, even if they can be and are reworked in new acts of learning. And it strikes me that to cultivate a habitually mindful body as an integral moment of psychosomatic existence would be to zone in on what phenomenologists have called the lived body or living flesh. Merleau-Ponty takes up the long-standing insight that to touch is always to be touched, to have the feeling of touching. By way of both passive and active touch, the body is constituted as an outside with an inside. Everything that is felt on from outside is at once felt within from inside, and in a Husserlian vein, this permanent presence of my body with me is a structural condition of recognizing this body as uniquely mine and of correlating the visual appearances of my extremities with the feeling of them. Such correlation is itself a condition of perceiving the bodies of others as having their own sensitive interiorities. Merleau-Ponty agrees, my body's presence with me is a condition of grasping others and the things in the world. The perception of both and the perception of both of one's own body vary together because they are two sides of a single experience. But even when I thematize the bodily reflexivity of touching and being touched, needed to recognize this body as mine, its ambiguity is ineliminable. I may try to register my body from the outside over the course of an activity, as if it were an external thing being touched. Alternatively, I may try to feel it from the inside as doing the touching. yet I have to switch from one to the other, giving only one my attention. I am always too late to catch the overall phenomenon. It is well known that in Merleau-Ponty's late ontology of the flesh, the self-sentient and the sensible cross over into each other. The flesh of the body and the flesh of the world are always a couple becoming one, where this oneness is imminent without ever being realized in fact. The toucher is only in the world as touched and tangible, and the seer in the world as seen and visible. And the relation of activity and passivity is always reversible in principle, and often in fact, where it is another that brings me under their eyes or under their hands, or where they might do so. The self-sentient as both active and passive is exposed in the world, a passivity that is not dominated by activity, for which for its part is not surprised by the former. But in some situations, and by way of the reversibility of the flesh of body and world, this passively being exposed in the world can come to the fore. Merleau-Ponty remarks that many painters have sometimes had the sense of being looked at by the things, which does not have to entail that trees or flowers or hills are looking back, but that each marks out a possible perspective or point of view from there on me as a painter who is right here, something spotted by Jan Haley, that each marks out my vulnerability to otherness in the world. Reflection that is aware of itself as reflecting on the unreflected knows that it cannot give rise to a kind of objectification that would catch the lived body's peculiar reflexivity and reversibility in themselves. It can only point to these constitutive moments of experience. But would the kind of attention enjoyed by mindfulness therefore involve a kind of naivety, since it cannot get to the heart of our bodily activities, only focusing on one or other term at a time? The defender of a mindful approach could, I think, respond that the said approach is not to be modeled on a transcendental philosophy that endeavors to capture our experiencing and experience body and the experience world. Still less is it concerned with the essential features of experience and, following on this, with their material a priori's or non-causal conditions. Mindfulness does indeed enjoin a kind of naivety in its focus on the present, but not of a harmful variety. Its proponent could respond further that it avoids or evades a specifically Western presumption, namely that existence is essentially projective, such that self-realization or authentic life are regulative ideas that we must endlessly approach without ever reaching. The highest or the best is somewhere else and in the future. As for the objection that one can only be mindful of one term or aspect of one's experience at a time, focusing on this or that facet of an object, or this or that moment of embodied and effective life, the mindful person can remark that a panoptical conception of experience is renounced no less than a theoretical stance in general. I would hazard the guess that its practice involves a sliding transition of attentiveness, which will more often overlap with what the phenomenologists call a sliding transition of manifolds. In the latter, each appearance slides smoothly into the next one as we track something in moving, or as it moves, as there is an approaching or a receding. In a sliding transition of attentiveness, we would shift from one facet of an object to another, zoning in and out and across, but without any intrusive breaks. And in focusing on our overall perceptual life, we would shift our focus from the active to the passive, and from the somatically felt to the effectively felt, without taking these as discrete parts of the experience. That is, without taking them as pieces that would be discontinuous with each other. Such smooth and sliding transitions would be exemplified and indeed fostered by techniques of Pilates and yoga. On my view, Merleau-Ponty comes closest to a mindful relation to the thing when he writes of its perceptual style, of seeing its distinctive style for the first time, or as if for the first time. And the first time has its own dignity, which is more often passed over by later rationalizations and reconstructions. And here he can best speak for himself. I quote, "Theoretical and practical decisions in my personal life can certainly grasp my past and my future from a distance. They can give my past, along with all of its accidents, a definite sense by following it up with a certain future, of which, après coup, this past will be said to have been the preparation. And they can introduce a historicity into my life. But there is always something artificial to this order. I currently understand my first 25 years as a prolonged childhood that had to be followed by a difficult weaning process in order to arrive finally at autonomy. If I think back to these years, such as I lived them, and such as I now carry them within me, their happiness refuses to be explained by the protective atmosphere of the parental milieu. The world itself was more beautiful. Things were more fascinating. And I can never be certain of understanding my past better than it understood itself while I lived it, nor can I ever silence its protest. Merleau-Ponty would often say that he had an incomparable childhood, and this he had in common with Sartre. For such individuals, the world of the child will always be something of a magical domain or a lost realm. He can assert this, moreover, by recommending a life that is more closely oriented around the present. We find him in substantial agreement with Jules de Gaultier about what the latter called the Bovary Syndrome. Somebody caught within it habitually constructs scenarios that are only remotely realizable or not at all. Such a person's imaginative powers are both effectively and effectively sundered from others and from those situations that might moderate them and from which they could be actualized. Such a consciousness is condemned to dissatisfaction and disappointment. What we would call real life is always happening somewhere else, and the here and now is so dreary and sterile as to be incapable of transformation. A disposition to idealize others in idealized relationships with oneself becomes the gravedigger of an existence that projects and pursues life possibilities. In recommending a more centered and appreciative existence, by contrast, Merleau-Ponty is in accord with the proponent of mindfulness. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Tim. I'll start to take questions if and when they arise. I think we've got one in the chat straight away from Anya Daly, so we can start with that. I'll read it. Thank you so much for such a deep and wide-ranging paper, Tim. Beyond the wider implications of mindfulness for aesthetics and the art of lace working, how might you see this in the mission of philosophy and the philosophical community? We're enjoined by Merleau-Ponty, Husserl and Dogen to return to beginner's mind, but in the mundane world of current philosophy, we're required to present expertise, which seems in absolute opposition to beginner's mind and may lock us into delusion.
Thanks, Andrew. Anya, that's a really good question. I guess the way I would try to answer it and to try to say that that present expertise is not in absolute opposition to beginner's mind would be to retain, if not the fascination of the first time or the wonder of the first time, the care of the first time. Not all children will destroy the world, and we often see their fascination with new things also being a care for them. And I think that people like Matthew Crawford recommend this kind of care for the familiar, to mind things so that we reduce the embodied energy in the world. It's even electric cars consume a huge amount of energy in their production, and we could talk for hours about the cobalt mines in Africa that contribute to them, as do child labor. But it seems to me that the worship of production, the conscious production of the new, is one of our fundamental problems. As Nietzsche says, we're so concerned with the new, with novelty, with these tropes of modernity, that we have devalued our daily bread. So what I'd like to build on is the kind of account that would combine expertise with care for things. This is why I found Crawford's shop class as soulcraft so enlightening. But this would be another kind of world, another kind of community. But it's something that may be coming at us very fast. If we look at the price of petroleum fuels and various other things in the coming world. But there is a difficulty. There is an opposition to beginner's mind that can lock us into delusion, and the kind of expertise that would appreciate things, that would mind them, that would repair them, and that would have the satisfaction of a job well done. So good question. I'm not sure I can answer it beyond that. No, sorry, I haven't quite answered it. You also referred to the sorry, that's a question for Lisa.
Yeah. We have a question from Georgios, who's online. Is there anyone in the room at the moment? Yeah. Okay, I'll come to your question online in a moment, but that's fine. You can go first. Are you sure? Okay. So I'll just read this question out, which is for Lisa. Thanks, Lisa, for this great and thought-provoking presentation. I tend to agree that mindfulness, as well as various other ideas and practices, seem indeed to have been colonized by a corporate language, but I am wondering if the insistence on this colonization as an ultimate and all-encompassing event obstructs us from being mindful of ways in which mindfulness, even in its current application, resists and possibly challenges the corporate lifestyle. Do you think that there are instances where our concrete experience of such practices might contradict the narratives provided by Heidegger or Marx?
Thanks, Georgios. Yeah, I think it would be, there's passages in Heidegger where he talks about philosophy as metaphysics and this relation to thinking or poetic thinking. And he says, it's not about setting up an opposition. It's not the case that what we're trying to do is to simply say, no, not that. It's not a rejection. He's really adamant about this, right from the very early work all the way through to the later work. And I think we would have to take that as the model, so that it would not be merely a case of saying, no, this, what we get in this kind of corporate mindfulness is to be rejected, right? So, because there is still something there, just like there is still something there in representational or even or calculative thinking, there's still something there. The danger only comes from thinking that that is all that is there. And I think here then, and that's sort of where I was trying to go, I think here then the question of language or the question of naming becomes really important. So I think there is something in mindfulness in this everyday sense that retains a trace of what it might be that could be productive. But my concern would be that the name mindfulness has been, as you so nicely put it, so colonized by corporatization that what it might offer us has been obscured. And so then I think it might be useful to think of mindfulness or meditative thinking in different terms. I'm not fully decided what those terms might be, and they would have to retain a relation to mindfulness in general. But yes, absolutely. I think there are there are experiences of these practices that that would allow us to tap into the kind of freedom they might generate. I'm not sure if that totally answers your question.
Well, okay, I think it says thanks, Lisa, so it presumably does. So we have a question from the floor, yeah.
Should I go?
Yes, well, just
Here?
No, here. Now.
Oops. Hello. There. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
Hi, Lisa. Hi, Tim. Thank you so much for your talks. That's great. So I have more of a comment, less a question for Lisa. I really enjoyed this presentation, and actually it touches a little bit on what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, even though you put it very clearly and much better than I will. So I was thinking, when you were saying that mindfulness, especially the way it has been treated in the West in the past few decades, might also block us from thinking authentically and making radical questions. I was thinking of a friend of mine who is a Lacanian psychoanalyst in Dublin, and who always criticizes cognitive-based interventions that use mindfulness as their core strategy for not being radical enough, like a hairdresser, she was telling me, who does exactly the same haircut to everybody despite how their face is, or despite their needs anyway. So yes, so I was thinking, well, I have a lot of questions, but maybe just to link it a little bit with Professor Cohen's presentation a little bit earlier. What do you think? So mindfulness training means cultivating the ability to be anchored in the present moment. All right. So mindfulness obviously is lost when we think of past memories, and I was wondering, what do you think that is ever possible, just to leave the past behind? And if it is, do you think it might be dangerous, potentially? Yeah, I'm not sure if that was a very clear question, but thank you both.
Thanks, Evie. I think this is really a productive question. So this idea that mindfulness is the ability to be anchored in the present moment. There are places, in the memorial address where Heidegger echoes that kind of language. But I think he's very clear that the danger of something like the Gestell or the in framing, the danger there is that we think anchoring in the present moment merely in a kind of historiological, word is always troubling for me, historiological sort of way, or in terms of just what he calls elsewhere chronology, instead of thinking it as being historical in terms of our existence. So I don't think this kind of anchoring that Heidegger talks about in terms of the Gelassenheit or in letting be, that kind of anchoring could not really be understood in terms of the present as opposed to the past or as opposed to the future, but rather in terms of presencing, right? Our capacity, our way of being, through which we are by drawing on the past and projecting into the future. The danger I think Heidegger is trying to point to is precisely this kind of understanding of just staying in the present, as in right now, without tapping into how that now is itself always already inhabited by the past and the future. Our being historical demands that. So any kind of awareness has to be an awareness of existence rather than awareness of being present. It is an awareness of presencing, I think. So then it would not so much be a case of leaving the past, but rather of allowing the past to sort of come to us in some way, rather than thinking of it as something done, like an object that we can go back and collect and then put to use. It is more that the past in some sense continues. And so it's more about, I think it is more about letting the past in some way presence. You always get tangled in knots when talking about this with Heidegger. But I think we would have to be careful of understanding the present just as this kind of discrete moment. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Evie, but I do think it's a very productive one. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can see that there's one or two questions in the chat, but I'm going to abuse my privilege because I want to ask Tim to expand on something, if you don't mind, Tim, which I found really interesting. I think, and if I mischaracterize it, you can tear it up. But I found it really interesting. You began to use the word or deploy this notion of communion at one point in your talk, which I really liked. And I felt that you were sort of hinting at something like the possibility of without being too technical, co-intending or paying joint attention or something like that. And I mean, I suppose you could have questions about, the skeptic is going to have questions about, well, in virtue of what is it the same or something, but we say we push those questions to one side. But we say we know that Husserl is worried about solipsism, and he kind of announces that at different times, and he's thinking about the co-constitution of objects perhaps in ways. And it sounded like, or if I've got you right, that there's there's obviously something richer going on with Merleau-Ponty, and in using that word communion, is that kind of what you were getting at? And would you elaborate on it a little bit if you'd indulge me?
Yeah, that's great, man. That's very useful. Thank you. Communion in two senses. There is joint attention and also being at one with another person in love and sexuality, which he talks about in a much more interesting way later on in his career. Merleau-Ponty, when he talks about myself and Paul looking at the same landscape and picking out the same things, comes tantalizingly close to an account of joint attention in phenomenology of perception, though it's never developed. But in the main, the communion with things is what he's talking about, not so much with others, but communion with things at the end of a gaze. And one of his nice examples is I can lie down and make myself comfortable and look at the blue of the sky, and I can be absorbed with it, seem to be absorbed in it. I can seem to float off within it, so that the act-object character of perception almost disappears. It would be closest to the pure experience of a pure quality that he criticizes elsewhere. And the reason he says this, because he says we go wrong if we see everything in touch of schematization, projection, the organization of both posture and milieu towards an outcome. Because there's also, as he puts it, in regard with perception, there's a natural self that's sided with the world, that makes us gear into the world in a certain way without any volition, without any initiative on our part. And another example he gives, let's say I'm walking down a lane and I want to get to a farmhouse to see my friend, or I simply want to enjoy the bird song. And I'm solicited by a beautiful flat flagstone to walk on that flagstone because it will facilitate my task. And yet it turns out to be a mere patch of sunlight. I was already prepared to walk on it, to realize this or that project, not necessarily an instrumental project. And this was not any initiative on my part. It was the body communioning with the world. As he puts it, the body that is better informed than I am about the world, better informed than I am about my projects, about my initiatives, than what in Kantian terms I would call my spontaneous life. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. Thank you for that.
Yep.
So I'm aware, or I'm cognizant of the fact that we're sort of just about out of time. I'm going to ask the chief, are we allowed to have another 2 questions from online, or should we wrap up?
Okay, all right, just 3 minutes though.
We've got 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Lisa, for you to answer those questions in the chat if you're so minded.
I wasn't paying attention, sorry.
So there's a question from Pirik. Could the term spiritual exercise put forward by Pierre Hadot replace mindfulness? On the other hand, wouldn't each word we come up with be co-opted or distorted anyway, in brackets or in parentheses, whatever? There is also Care of the Self by Foucault and Therapeutic Argument by Martha Nussbaum as candidates. And then the question after that is, how would you rename possibly mindfulness? As in the end of your talk, you suggested this possibility. So just in 2 minutes and about 25 seconds.
Well, let me tell you. Yeah, I think this danger is always going to be there. And I think, you know, I think there's this, you've mentioned this, Mahan, in your discussion as well. There is a very strong continuity in Heidegger's thinking from right the way through. And one of the ways I tend to sort of anchor how I engage with Heidegger is through his account of truth in Being in Time, where he talks about being uncovering as what is true in a primordial sense, and the importance of uncovering things over and over again. And there is always this danger, not just in what we might call mindfulness or in any kind of practice or in any kind of thinking, that words sort of lose their revelatory power, right? They lose their capacity to show us something because we get caught up in just passing the word along, right? Blanchot has this beautiful line where he says, words almost need to remain foreign to us to allow them to still show us something. Language inevitably becomes familiar, and once it becomes familiar, there is this danger that it becomes just a word thing, a kind of object. So yes, that danger would be always there. And so the point, I think, would perhaps not to focus on renaming, not to focus on the name as such, but on the very act of renaming and rethinking this process or this sort of meditative way of being. So it, not that it doesn't matter, but it almost doesn't matter what name we settle on. It's more that we think, is this really what is being revealed here? Is this really the practice we are engaged with? Yeah, so I think that's something we have to constantly do rather than be concerned with settling on something fixed. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you very much both to Tim and to Lisa for fantastic talks, and thanks everyone for your questions online and in the room. We're
so much
going
for your
to break
attention.
now.
Thank you, Mal.
But thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Okay, so 1 hour break and
We have a 55-minute break.
55 minutes break. Lunch
Okay.
break. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So should people online need to know that as well, that we'll reconvene at 2:30, is it?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right.
Okay, we'll see everyone back here then at 2:30.
Ne è grafito?